We stood at the edge of the forest, huddled together, brother, sister, and I, clutching the hem of my mother's skirt, looking south. Down in the valley below, fires were blazing. Our homestead, the stables and cattle yards, the peasants' houses covered with straw, all were on fire. From time to time, muffled explosions were heard, and another burning thatched roof flew into the air. Soon all the houses were engulfed in flames. The wind carried to our ears the roar of the cattle and the neighing of the horses in the stalls, the cries of the women who had not had time to escape to the forest. Those who ran to the forest with us looked at my mother as a saviour. They were all women. The men by this time had either been arrested or, like my father, mobilized into a foreign army to fight in a foreign war, often against their compatriots who had also been mobilized into the army of another enemy state occupying another part of our country. The women and children surrounding us cried and screamed incessantly. Some, exhausted from crying, fell down and their tears watered the dry ground and their hair tangled with the thick grass. My mother did not scream. She watched the fire raging in the valley in silence, clutching my hand tighter and tighter. I was the youngest of the children, until I cried out in pain. Her eyes were still dry, but her lips moved, though they made no sound. She was talking to herself. Finally, the mother couldn't stand it any longer and screamed. Beasts, murderers, godless men. You take from me everything I have, but I will repay you. God knows I'll have my revenge. You will burn in hell. You will die a painful death, forgotten by all. As long as I live, I will fight you and teach my children to hate you, to take revenge, to live and to kill. She went mad with rage. I screamed. Her outburst frightened me. She was not the gentle mother I had known her to be. But she was unstoppable now. Anger and pain contorted her face. You will not escape us. You may kill hundreds of thousands, but there will still be those who will find you and kill you. They will kill. God help us. Shaking her fist at the invisible enemies in the valley, which was completely hidden in a cloud of smoke, she led us into the forest. Come, children, you must live, was all she said. These tragic events from my early childhood took place during the First World War. We lived in the south of Poland, in the village of Gazaloka, about 40 kilometers southwest of Krakow. At that time, Poland was divided between three neighboring countries, Germany, Austria, and Russia, who were fighting against each other. Their armies poured into Poland, burning villages, looting towns, raping, killing. We spent the rest of the day and night in the forest. Early in the morning, I woke up cold and hungry. I looked round. My brother and sister were still asleep, but my mother was not around. I screamed, and my scream woke up my brother Antek. He was 6 years older than me. Don't scream, little one. Mum will come back, my brother said, and hugged me. I fell asleep again, and when I woke up again, I saw my mother coming towards us with a heavy sack on her shoulder. I have brought some food, she said, and clothes for you. I managed to slip in unnoticed in the darkness. They had drunk too much and were sleeping the sleep of the dead. What happened to you, Mummy? Antek asked. There's blood all over your sweatshirt. I killed one of them, strangled him. He was sleeping in my bed, she answered, and added, here's bread, cheese, sugar, eat up, children. We had not seen sugar for a long time, and now we were happy to eat. I was too young to realize what had happened during the night in the valley. I was not frightened by her confession, but I noticed Antek's eyes on his mother, noting the determined expression on her face, the anger burning in her eyes, the bloodstains on her jumper, and the way she looked at her hands after slicing the bread and cheese. She brought her open palms up to her eyes, scrutinized them intently for a while, and then wiped them sharply against her skirt like wet hands with a towel and said, "God must forgive me, or there is no justice in this world," and then, turning to us, added, "Hurry up, children, it is time to go." "But I'm still hungry and tired," whimpered Lida. Ludmila was only a year older than me. We called her Lida. "We'll eat later." "If there's anything to eat," answered her mother. "War always brings hunger, children. We will all starve, and God only knows how long it will last." For 2 years, like thousands of people in southern Poland, we wandered from east to west, depending on where the front moved. We lived in ruined barns and houses, in the cellars of bombed-out buildings, in forest huts we made from branches, earth and stones. Sometimes we sat huddled together in fields or meadows, shivering from the cold, drenched, hungry, listening to the volleys of the guns that were destroying the villages. Always hungry, afraid of the soldiers, we constantly wondered where to get food and where we would be tomorrow, in a week, in a month. During our wanderings, we acquired a rather bizarre set of clothes. One day, not far from the front line, we came across a cart full of expensive, beautiful clothes, looted somewhere by German soldiers. The horses and several soldiers had been killed in an artillery bombardment. Unfortunately, there were only women's clothes and nothing for Antek and me. While Mother and Lida chose dresses for themselves, Antek and I took the uniforms off the dead soldiers. Of course, the uniforms were too big, especially for me, but they kept me warm at night and I stayed dry when it rained. The uniforms had huge pockets, which was great because you could store food in them. We were constantly thinking about food. The cold, the fear, the lack of basic amenities took a back seat to the constant feeling of hunger. All our conversations, all our thoughts were connected to food. Food was everything to us. Food meant life, the possibility to live another day, week, month, to survive the winter or even the war. The end of war meant peace, and peace meant food. It is not strange that all my childhood memories are linked to thoughts of food, of abundant food. I dreamed of plates of hot soup, huge chunks of bread and pork. How I hated waking up. I dreamed of food. This dream had a real basis. One winter, hungry and shivering from the cold, we came upon a gamekeeper's hut in the forest, and his wife, taking pity, shared her lunch with us. Alas, I, accustomed to abundant food, threw up. But even this could not spoil my unexpected holiday. The sensation of hot pork soup remained the fondest memory for years to come. The constant feeling of hunger told us where food was most likely to be found. Very soon we realized that former battlefields were the perfect place for our search. We could always find something to eat there, for example, from dead soldiers. Retreating armies left mortally wounded and dead horses. We used knives to cut up the huge carcasses and, dragging away our trophies, pieces of meat, clothes, weapons, felt the triumph of a successful sortie. If it was cold, horse meat could be stored for quite a long time, but in the heat of the day, after a couple of days it began to give off an unbearable stench. We cooked the horse meat over a fire, ate until we were exhausted, and rested after the meal, glad that we had filled our bellies. Antek learned how to trap game and taught me to do the same. Sometimes we had a hare, partridge, pigeon, or pheasant for dinner. In the fields we dug up potatoes and other vegetables, found and chewed grain, having previously cleaned it, and in summer we collected fruits of wild fruit trees. In short, we rarely had enough to eat. We fell asleep thinking about where we would find food tomorrow, and, most importantly, bread, which was almost an unattainable dream for us. We soon realized that no matter how hungry you are, you should always save some food for tomorrow, like a squirrel saving up for tomorrow. This was hammered into my young head so often and persistently that I developed a sort of complex. Years later, I would sometimes catch myself hoarding bits of bread or other food, and losing myself under the stares of my friends. I was ashamed to admit why I did so. One day, when I had had enough to eat, I first broached the subject of family history. It started when I asked my mother if I had a father. "Of course you have a father, but he's away now in the army." "So why did he go away and leave us alone?" It was incomprehensible to me how my father could leave us in such a difficult time. "Father didn't want to leave. He was forced." Antek answered for his mother. He remembered well how it had happened. He was taken away under escort. He escaped twice, but in the end they caught him. Bastards. Strangely enough, his mother did not scold Antek, although she used to shame us when we used swear words we had learnt from the refugees. "Will he come back, Mum?" "Yes, he will, of course he will." When the war is over, Mother assured us fervently. Trying to speak in a language we could understand, she explained that my father had been mobilized into the Russian army, and even earlier my grandfather had died, who had been punished for avoiding military service in the same army. He was tied by his legs to a wagon that raced through Gazilovka. When the wagon stopped at the other end of the village, my grandfather was already dead. His head was smashed, and his face had turned into a bloody mess. The fact that our great-grandfather had died in one of the national uprisings against the German invaders, our mother did not think it necessary to tell us, nor what had happened to our family home. Her anger grew as she recounted all the misfortunes that had befallen not only the country, but our family as well. Expressively gesticulating with her rough, heavy hands, she poured out all the accumulated hatred against the Germans, Austrians and Russians who were responsible for all our misfortunes. "They all had a hand in it," she declared, "but the time will come and Poland will be reborn. Even if it takes us 100 years. You must remember we will fight for Poland, to fight and kill to do what they are doing to us. With fire and sword we'll rid the country of them. If not this, then the next generation will liberate Poland. That's why we must survive. We must live and kill." That night, for the first time, I didn't dream of soup with pork and bread. The dream, inspired by my mother's story, was heavy. So at an early age I killed for the first time, so far only in a dream, or in a nightmare. The end of 1918 found us east of Lvov. By this time we must have walked thousands of kilometers, running away from all the armies, German, Austrian, Russian, hiding, retreating, advancing like fronts that moved back and forth across southern Poland. One day my mother announced, "We have our own government. We have Poland. Children, you understand, we are free." We tried to understand, though frankly we couldn't see any difference. We were still hungry. "Now we can go home," Mother said, as if home was round the corner, not several 100 kilometers away. "So tomorrow we are going home." But the next morning Mother began to shake like a fever. By evening she was unconscious. She had pneumonia and her body, weakened by hunger, didn't want to fight the disease. She was getting worse and worse, and there was nothing we could do. The weather was unusually frosty. The village where we were staying, though only 15 kilometers from Lvov, seemed isolated from the world. There was no doctor, no medicine, nothing we could do to help our mother. Apart from the four of us, there was only one peasant family living in the village. The only family left alive. We crammed ourselves into the surviving room. all 11 of us, not counting the cow. We realized that Mother was dying. We realized, but we didn't cry, we were too shocked. Suddenly Antek said, "Let's take Mum to Lvov. We'll find a doctor there. We must do it, and we'll do it." They put Mum on a makeshift sledge, covered her with straw, and put stones heated on fire and wrapped in rags. They left at night. Antek pulled the sledge, and Lida and I pushed from behind, sometimes hanging on the sledge to catch our breath. Mother didn't regain consciousness. Sometimes it seemed to us that she was dead, and we were carrying a corpse, but when she moaned, we picked up the pace. By morning we reached Lviv and found a hospital where a doctor and a few nurses were trying to help everyone who needed it. While Mum was being put to bed, Lida and I fainted. The next day when we came to, we realized we were lying on the bed. Antek explained that we were not sick, but just overstretched. "And Mum would live," my brother added. "The doctor said she would recover." Mother stayed in the hospital for 3 weeks, and all that time we Antek, Lida and I lived in various places in railway stations, in cellars, on the floor of the hospital kitchen, begging and stealing food. But the time came when my mother, still very weak, had to leave the hospital. One of the nurses allowed us to occupy a corner of her room, but first we had to be sanitized and rid of lice. All this was done at the hospital. We were washed, our clothes were treated, and then we were able to move into the nurse's room. We now had a roof over our heads, but there was still the food problem. Not only was there no money, but nothing that we could sell or exchange for food. That's when Mum had an idea. Whilst still in hospital, she entertained everyone with fortune-telling. She must have been very successful, because after she left the hospital bed, people came to her and asked for fortune-telling. Her mother decided to take up fortune-telling and became Madame Suzanne, the clairvoyant. Even in the war-torn town, people were willing to pay in money or food for her predictions. Spring passed, summer came, and we couldn't get back on the road, back to our Gazilovka. There was Poland. Poland had a government, but the threat lurked on both sides. The Ukrainians had surrounded and attacked Lvov, demanding that it be annexed to Ukraine, which they were going to make an independent state. At the same time, the Russians began a campaign against Poland. We managed to avoid the siege of Lvov, but had to stop at a small town about 32 kilometers north of Lvov. A horse kicked Lida and broke her leg. The local specialist said that the return home was postponed indefinitely. At this time, Sapezanka was already occupied by the Bolsheviks. We knew that the Bolsheviks had invaded the country, but we did not expect them to advance so rapidly westwards. Without much warning, without the increasing rumble of guns so familiar to us from previous years, the Bolshevik cavalry attacked the town. The Polish soldiers in the city were either shot or retreated, and the massacre of civilians began. At first, it seemed as if some kind of game was being played. People were taken out of their homes to the market square. Then, after they had been herded into one corner, they were told that they had a chance to save their lives. All they had to do was to run to the opposite corner of the square. If the Red Cavalrymen, who would enter the game from the middle of the square, did not catch the runners, they would be free to go home. So the game began. One by one, men, women, children were dragged out of the crowd, and after a few lashes were forced to run. The first person who tried to run to the other side was killed by a dashing cavalryman who, sitting on horseback, whistling and hooting, with his sabre drawn, suddenly appeared on the square. Engaged in the game, the horsemen picked out new victims. Some ran well, some tried to dodge the sabre, but none managed to run to safety. A couple of cavalrymen fell off their horses, slipping on the cobblestones to the friendly laughter of their comrades. Then the Reds decided that it was foolish to kill all the women, as they could be used for other purposes. Showered with curses, the cavalrymen, working their nagayas, separated the women and drove them into the houses, continuing the game with the remaining men. Having disposed of the last of them, the Russians began to go round the corpses lying in the square and exchange impressions of skillfully delivered sabre blows. Thus ended the Bloody Friday in Sepizanka. We managed to avoid a terrible beating. By the time the Russians reached the house where we were staying, we had hidden ourselves in a shelter used by our hosts to store grain and foodstuffs concealed from confiscation by the armies passing through the town. The cellar lid, caked with mud and peat, merged with the ground and was almost impossible to detect. When the first cavalrymen appeared on the outskirts of the town, we dived into the shelter, listening with bated breath to the noise coming from the surface. The walls shook with the clatter of horses. Sitting in the darkness, we shuddered whenever one of the horses' hoofs struck the lid of the shelter. At last the riders had gone, or so we wanted to believe, and we lifted the lid a little to look round and let in the fresh air. "There doesn't seem to be anyone," said Mother, looking round. "We should stock up on food and water before they come back. You stay here." "I'll go with you," Antek said firmly. "It will be easier for the two of us." They returned a few minutes later with bread, beetroot and a jar of water. Antek had also brought an overcoat. Having spread it on the floor of our temporary shelter, we finally stretched out our tired legs. But Lida could not settle down, saying that it was uncomfortable for her to sit. She found something in the pocket of her overcoat, and when we opened the lid of the cellar we saw that she was holding a pistol, and a loaded one at that. "Give it to me," said Antek. "It might come in handy." For 2 days we sat in the shelter, lifting the lid from time to time to get a breath of fresh air. I wonder why the Bolsheviks didn't burn the city. We were used to enemy armies destroying cities first. Soon everything became clear to us. In the evening the Reds returned and stayed until morning. They were going to camp in the town. We did not know how many people were in the house near which we were hiding, but judging from the noise, about 24. In the afternoon they all, leaving one to look after the remaining horses, rode off on horseback somewhere. The man on duty fed the horses, broke some of the furniture for firewood, and set about cooking. Then there was silence, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the cries of the rooster, who had returned from the field in search of the chickens, which by this time were hanging with their necks twisted on a hook driven into the wall of the barn. The guard was dozing. We did not take advantage of the favourable opportunity that day. We still had water and some food. But the next day the water ran out, and Mother decided to make a foray. Antek opened the lid and watched as the mother walked calmly past the horses and approached the well. So far everything was going well. She slowly lowered the bucket into the well, drew water, placing the jar on the edge of the well, poured water into it, and headed back. Suddenly the bucket snapped and, with a rattling uncoiling of the chain, fell into the well. The mother froze, and then, hearing curses coming from the house and the banging of the door opening from the kitchen, she rushed to escape and fell. A moment later a Russian soldier stood over her with a pistol clutched in his hand. "Aha, woman. I'm going to do something to you. Stand up," he shouted. The mother was staring at the gun in his hand. "Get up, you old bitch!" Mother still didn't move. Lida and I started screaming. Antek, looking through the ajar gap, shook with fear. "Get up," again shouted the soldier and kicked lying motionless mother. Grabbing the mother by the hair with one hand, he tried to lift her off the ground with a weighty kick. The mother resisted strenuously and suddenly grabbed the gun with both hands and pulled the rapist down. But could she handle a healthy man? He gave her several hard blows on her face, but she, almost losing consciousness, was still holding onto the gun. Suddenly the soldier lost his balance, fell to the ground, and his mother immediately clutched at his throat. "Antek! Antek!" screamed the mother, clenching her fingers tighter and tighter around her enemy's throat. Hearing the scream, Antek quickly got out of the shelter and rushed to his mother with the pistol Lyda had found in his overcoat pocket. Holding the gun with both hands, he fired at the soldier until he ran out of cartridges. Then he threw the gun away and kicked the soldier with his foot. He groaned, moved, tried to sit up, but suddenly fell backwards and fell silent. Antek looked at his mother. She was lying motionless. "Mummy! Mummy! Get up!" shouted the brother. The mother did not regain consciousness. Then Antek splashed water in her face, and she finally came to her senses. "Get up, Mummy, we have to hide." The mother saw the corpse and the two guns lying on the ground and shifted her gaze to Antek's pale face. Her face was bruised and abrasion, her lips broken and bleeding. Coming to her senses, she immediately made a decision. "We can't stay here. When they come back, they'll turn this place upside down to find who did this." "Let's bury him," Antek suggested. "That would take time, and we don't have it." "Then let's get him down to the cellar," his brother persisted. "The first place they'll look is in the cellar." "Shall we fill it with hay?" "No, they'll find him right away." "So what do we do?" "I don't know, but we have to act fast." Mother was still hesitating when shots were heard from the town. There wasn't a second to lose. "Antek, help me get him out of here." "Where to?" "To our hideout. It's the only place we can hide him." "Hurry up." Mum and Antek dragged the corpse, and Lida and I helped them as best we could. Finally, we managed to drag the corpse to our hiding place. We pushed the body down, followed by ourselves, and closed the lid. But something was bothering the mother. It was quiet outside. We opened the lid again, and the mother looked around. There was no sign of life. "Let's go," she said to Antek. "You'll spread the dung around the yard to hide the blood. I have to do something too. Hurry up." They rushed into the yard. While Antek was spreading fresh horse manure around the yard, his mother was doing something strange. She saddled one of the horses. Then she took her overcoat out of the house and tied it to the saddle. She opened the gate and whipped the horse. We saw the horse run off into the distance. Antek, having finished spreading the manure, ran into the house and emerged with a half-smoked, half-fried chicken. The mother filled a jug with water. At last they returned to the shelter. "Why did you do that to the horse?" Antek asked the mother. "They'll think he's gone." "They might think he's a deserter, sitting next to the man he had killed." Antek laughed. "They'll hang him when they catch him, won't they?" We had already seen corpses quite fresh and still warm, and those that had lain for days, blackened or frozen. Several times we've come across corpses that had been lying in the sun for a while, swollen, worm-eaten. We saw corpses that had been preyed upon by birds. Yes, we'd seen all this before. But now, in the pitch darkness, next to a body that had not yet cooled down, we felt differently. We could not see each other in the darkness, and did not know what each of us was thinking. Suddenly there were sobs. Antek was crying. I'm afraid. Let's open the lid a little so that it's a little brighter. We lifted the lid a little. Are you sure he's dead? Antek asked in a trembling voice. We are sure, answered the mother for all of us. She made us rise and covered the corpse with her overcoat. Couldn't we hide somewhere else? Antek asked in a trembling voice. The sound of hoofbeats answered his question. We quickly closed the lid and hid. Shouts and curses came from outside. Those who arrived searched for the guard in the barns and under the shed, and finally we heard what a scoundrel. The horse trick had worked. After dark we opened the lid of the shelter without fear of being discovered. We had water, bread, and such luxuries as half-roasted chicken, but we were not hungry. As soon as any of us moved, we heard squelching noises beneath us. But we just had to move from time to time to stretch our numb bodies. The tension grew. One by one we began to cry. Mother tried to whisper to calm us down, but we couldn't stop. We were shaking with sobs, but we were afraid to move so that we would not hear the terrible sounds. The sobs were getting louder and louder. Lida was crying out loud, and my mother couldn't help herself. Her nerves were also on edge. Shut up now, she shouted. Shut up, or you'll bring the Bolsheviks down on your head. We calmed down for a while, but it didn't last long. Let's get out of here, Mummy, we began to beg. Let's go somewhere else, but just get out of here. Please. She was probably as eager as we were to change shelter, but it was only at midnight that we ventured to the surface. We crawled out quietly, closed the cellar door, and crept out of the yard. One of the horses, noticing the movement, gave a low neigh, apparently thinking that it was about to be fed. We froze, but there was silence all around. We got out through the gate and crawled towards the fields. They forgot the food in the cellar. Antek shouted when we had already crawled a few hundred meters. But the thought that the shelter that had become a grave for a Russian soldier might become our grave sobered us. No one felt the urge to go back. We crawled a few hundred meters more and only then got to our feet. We did not know where we were going, and thought only of getting away from Sapizanka, our underground shelter and the corpse hidden in it. We walked across the field, lit by rare stars and moonlight, waded through thorny bushes, crossed a river, climbed a steep slope and slid down it into the forest. Dawn was dawning. We had no idea where we were going. We were dead tired, hungry, and decided to take a break. We found a small hollow under the roots of a wind-turned tree, covered it with lapnik, lay down, pressed tightly against each other, and fell asleep. I was awakened by the sun shining in my face. It was hot. Mum was still asleep. My stomach rumbled with hunger, and I started to think about where I could find something to eat. Just when I decided to take a good look around, I froze with fear. A man was looking at me from the edge of the hole where we were sleeping. All I could see was his head in a blue Confederate shirt. I was so frightened that I lost my voice. The only thing I could do was shove my mother with my shoulder. She woke up instantly, saw the man's face, and I felt her shrink in fear. Then the man jumped to his feet and, pointing his rifle at us, shouted in Russian, "Hands up." We raised our hands. Lida was still asleep. In a trembling voice, her mother said, "Stefan, push her up." The man was clearly confused when he saw the woman, covered in bruises and abrasions, and the small children, dirty and dressed in rags. He lowered his rifle. "I thought you were Bolsheviks," he said in Polish. We lowered our arms. Leader never woke up. "Who are you?" Mother asked. "A soldier." "What army?" "General Hayler's army." "I'm Polish, from America." "We're Poles, too," I squeaked, "and hungry." "I understand that. Where are you coming from?" "We ran away from Sepizanka." "The Bolsheviks are there," explained my mother. "We get through mostly at night." The soldier took something out of his pocket and handed it to me. "Here, try it. It's chocolate from America." I examined the small brown rectangles on all sides. "Do you like chocolate?" the soldier asked. "I don't. I've never seen it before." "Well, try some." I took his advice. "It's delicious." We ate all the chocolate, and the dirt on my face turned brown. But my hands were clean. I licked all 10 fingers and palms. Too bad I only have 10 fingers. I wish I had 10 fingers on each hand. During the few days we spent together, my mother learnt everything about Haller's army. General Joseph Haller formed an army of Polish immigrants. They came to help the Polish army resist the Bolshevik invasion. It was then that I first met Thomas. He was a lieutenant at the time and helped us a lot. My mother said he was from our village, but we didn't remember him. As a young man, he sailed to America, settled there, and now he returned to Poland with other volunteers. He always had pockets full of chocolate. He was a good man and treated our mother very well. Thomas got us a horse, a cart, blankets, and, oh wonder, tinned food, biscuits, and even a primus. He explained to my mother which road was the safest to take to the west, and travelled several miles with us. We were very grateful to him. We were on our way to Gazilovka. What happiness it was! After 2 years of wandering, forgetting what it meant to sleep in a clean bed and eat from a plate, we were finally coming home. Always hungry and cold, we ate only when we could find something to eat. We lived like wild animals that were constantly being hunted. We developed animal instincts. We strove to survive even when there seemed to be no point in clinging to life and when the chances of survival were practically zero. All our feelings centered in love and devotion to each other, which we never spoke aloud, and hate. But hatred was in abundance, and we talked about it much and fiercely. This hatred was born out of every Pole's love for his homeland. Neither propaganda, nor education, nor upbringing influences the patriotic feelings of Poles. They are born patriots. It was patriotism that gave Poles the desire to live, despite all the misfortunes, and the desire to kill in order to survive. The realization of this came, of course, much later in my mature years. In the meantime, I returned home, and I associated the word home with food abundance and a soft, warm bed. Even though we were now travelling by horse-drawn cart, it took us several weeks to reach Gazilovka. Compared to our 2 years of travelling east on foot, this journey seemed unusually pleasant, even though we were travelling through a country devastated by war, rarely slept under a roof, and still felt hungry. At least we did not have to hide from enemy soldiers. No, the war with the Bolsheviks was still going on, but we had left it behind us. And although memories of Sepizanka visited us from time to time, we thought more and more about the future. On a hot summer afternoon in 1919, we drove up a hill from which we could see our village. We stopped under 3 old lime trees with thousands of bees buzzing in their branches. Shading our eyes from the sun, we gazed into the valley before us. "Children, look, everything is just as it was before." "Nothing has changed," exclaimed the mother. We stood in silence for a long time until Antek broke the silence with a question. "Where is the church?" "I don't see it. It was burnt down." Don't you remember? Replied Mother. And the houses? Burned. Have you forgotten? And the manor house? The manor remains. At least its walls. Now come on, children. We rolled down the hill in a cloud of dust, crossed the river, and got to the other side without meeting a single living soul. We entered the village without seeing anyone, though there were trickles of smoke rising from 2 dilapidated houses. They drove along an avenue lined with poplars, rounded a pond, and stopped at the porch. Here we are, children, said the mother excitedly. There wasn't much left of our house. It was just a hulk in front of us. The brick walls and part of the roof had survived the fire. Doors, windows, and floors were burned, or maybe they were used as fuel. Weeds grew in the corners of the rooms in piles of rubble and ashes. The outbuildings were not in the best condition. The house was destroyed. But it's the only home we have. Children, we stay. We stayed and endured, although there were moments when my mother lost her strength from overstrain. We had to start life again on nothing. There was land, but only weeds grew on it, and there were not enough hands to cultivate it. We found ploughs and harrows, but of the working cattle we had only 1 horse on which we travelled home. There was no seed to sow, no potatoes to plant, and no fertilizer. The peasants in our village were in the same situation. Having survived the invasion of enemy armies, they were returning to the village from all parts of the country and facing the same problems. They were waiting for help from us. But how could we help them? Now we did not depend on the whether 2 rooms had been brought into a condition suitable for normal life. And of course we took care of the horse by making it a kind of stall. None of us had ever done carpentry or joinery, but necessity is the best teacher, as the Polish saying goes, and we learnt it by experience. Mother went back to fortune-telling again, receiving as payment a few eggs, bread, and a chicken. We ate the bread and put the eggs under the hen, and she brought out chicks. The sight of the yellow, fluffy lumps swarming around the yard put everyone in a great mood. To us, they were a sign of renewed life. If we could get grain for sowing, my mother thought, we would have bread next year. Oh, if only Father would come home soon. But Father never came home. In response to numerous inquiries, we finally received an official letter. It said, "We regret to inform you that, according to the established data, Anton Gazelle from Gazeloka, Krakow district, was executed by the Germans on the Silesian front as one of the organizers of the units of the independent Polish army formed after the defeat of the Austrian army. He is buried in a common grave, the exact location of which you will be informed later." I didn't remember my father, but I cried because I saw the others crying. My father was taken into the army when I was still in the cradle. I cried because we had hoped for his return, believing that everything would immediately change for the better if our father came home. Now I realized that he would never come back, and I would be one of those called war orphans. I hated those words, and for good reason. I cried also because my mother, after rereading the letter several times and crying with us, went about her business as if nothing had happened. But suddenly she burst into tears and threw herself hysterically on the bed. We were silent. We simply could not cry any more. Mother did not come to her senses until late in the evening. She called to us and, looking with inflamed eyes, said, "Listen, children. If Father had come back, things would have been much easier. But now we'll have to do everything on our own so we don't starve to death in our own home. We'll live. With God's help, we'll live. And one day we will have our revenge, if not this generation, then the next. You must remember that. I will never teach you mercy, children, never. The famine years came. From 1919 to 1921, we survived mainly because Antek and I were able to trap and kill game. But we were not always lucky. Deer became very shy, partridges disappeared, as well as hares, which used to be abundant in our area. We were hungry again. We had land, but no farm implements or domestic animals. At the end of 1921, Thomas appeared in the village. He visited us often that winter and married our mother in the spring. After that, our affairs improved considerably. Thomas, having done some operations that we did not understand, received money from America, where he had lived before the war. Thanks to this, we hired laborers, bought some cows and horses. The Gazelovka came to life. Mum, whom for several years we had seen only tired and preoccupied, began to smile more often. Antek left to study in Krakow, and Lida and I rode our old horse to the local school a few kilometers from Gazelovka. I was not noted for my diligence. I liked walking in the forest, watching animals and birds, following their tracks, checking nests in the trees much more than sitting at a desk. I climbed the tallest trees, settled comfortably in the fork of the branches, and could daydream for hours, watching the floating clouds, until some bird, dissatisfied with my presence near its nest, began to express its attitude to the uninvited guest with sharp cries. In 1924, my mother, Lida, and I sailed to America, where Thomas had gone a few months earlier. The thing was that Thomas has spent all his money on restoring our estate, and there was still a lot to be done. Funds were needed. So Thomas, who was still an American citizen, decided to return to America to do contracting work, and in a few years to earn the money that everyone needed. We left, entrusting the household to Thomas's brother. Antek stayed in Krakow in the care of his aunt. We returned to Poland in 1926. Antek was already at university, and Lida and I started going to secondary school. My mother, despite my desperate protest, wanted me to become a priest, and I had to study at a theological school for 2 years. But then I rebelled, volunteered for the army, and was sent to the officers' course of the communication troops in the training center located in Zgierz, near Warsaw. Upon completion of the course, I was assigned to a small unit based in Stanislaw, in southeastern Poland. The unit was in charge of intercepting and decoding Soviet communications and locating Soviet mobile transmitters. I had been in the service for almost a year when the commander called me in and asked if I would agree to sneak into Soviet territory to get information on new types of transmitters. I said yes. That's fine. First, you will go to Skala, to our unit, where you will receive clear instructions and get acquainted with one of our underground, who will be your guide and advisor. He knows his business. Your job is to get the data, and his is to get you there and back. I arrived in Skala in the evening, where I was met by a man dressed in civilian clothes with a horse-drawn sleigh. We travelled round the town twice before heading south. An hour later, we pulled up to a border post. The guard fed me lunch and then took me to a room where I could rest until morning. I did not fall asleep for a long time, listening to the sounds outside. There was the change of patrols. Plates and cups clinked. The phone rang, and from somewhere nearby came the sound of Morse code. How did I feel? Not that I was afraid, no, more like apprehensive. I didn't feel particularly excited about the upcoming event, and it wasn't even about patriotism or sense of duty. I was alone. Would my mother find out what I'd done if I didn't come back? And how soon would she learn of her son's death? Would she cry? Who else? Yanka. She won't cry. Why doesn't she ever write to me? I won't either. That's what she should do. When I woke up, I found a full set of ski gear next to my bed. I must have slept soundly as I didn't hear it all arrive. I was eating breakfast when an army captain and a man in civilian clothes entered the room. I stood at attention. The captain looked me over carefully from head to toe. "Have you been skiing much lately?" he asked. "Only if I had a free day, Captain." "Are you well?" "Yes, Captain, I've never." Good, sit down," he interrupted me. "How old are you?" Of course, he had already got all the information about me and knew perfectly well how old I was. 20, Captain." He looked at me sternly. Then, turning to the civilian, he said, pointing at me, "This is Junior Officer Geisel. He will go with you." "Until we return, you will call me Joseph," said the civilian, shaking hands with me. Then Joseph briefly spoke about the upcoming operation. Their group is conducting winter maneuvers about 20 kilometers across the border. Densely overgrown territory, forest. Here, he pointed to a place on the map, runs the railway. If everything goes on like last winter, then at the end of the maneuvers they should load into the train on the spare track. They are here now, he pointed again to a spot on the map, and we must intercept them before they leave. We have about 2 days to get to the other side between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. It should be fine here. It's snowing, and it will cover our tracks. The sentry brought a rucksack and white overalls. Joseph spoke short and clear, without wasting unnecessary words. "The overalls are needed for camouflage. Now look what's in the rucksack. Food and some clothes. Don't take anything extra. We're going to have to move fast. If you're overloaded, you'll sweat, and lying in the snow, you'll get cold and cough. That's unacceptable." Oh, I carefully examined the contents of the rucksack: a hard sausage, pork fat, a piece of pork, about a pound of sugar, a flask of rum and a hunting knife. "Is that all?" "What weapons shall we take?" I asked. "None. They make a lot of noise. You're bound to use it. The temptation is too great. We should keep quiet. Use the knife if you have to." "Yes, of course," I said with uncertainty in my voice. At that moment, the captain took a small leather wallet out of his pocket and handed it to me. "Hang it round your neck, and don't forget to return it to me when you get back. It contains several gold rings with diamonds." I must have looked very surprised, because Joseph hurried to explain. "That's in case you get caught. They'll think you're a common smuggler." Joseph then advised me to try out my skis, try on my overalls and rest. Try to sleep. "We'll have to stay awake for 2 days," Joseph explained. "We'll be on the road the whole time. Don't eat too much, it's bad for you before traveling." Joseph woke me up after midnight. He was wearing a ski suit with a white overalls over it. We had breakfast. Before leaving, Joseph gave me some final instructions. "Stay close to or behind me. No talking. Do what I do. If we split up, stay where we last saw each other. Don't shout. Don't make any noise. Stay quiet. If I don't return within the hour, turn back and follow the compass to the west. Don't go forward yourself. It won't work." We left on skis. Accompanied by the border patrol, we walked in complete silence. The snow was falling thickly, it was windy, and I could feel the skis cutting through the drifts. No one spoke a word, and only occasionally there was a whistling sound from the accidental contact of skis. Although Joseph was only a ski's length away from me, I could only see the outline of his figure against the snow. We entered the forest and stopped. Another patrol approached. I exchanged information with the patrol accompanying us. We were about 100 meters from the border from the forest clearing. No initiative, Joseph reminded us. Follow me. Without saying goodbye to the patrols, we took off our skis, walked a little deeper into the forest, stopped under a tree and listened. Then we walked a little further and stopped again, listening. And so on until we came to an open space at clearing. Behind us was the black wall of the forest. We lay down in the snow, blending in with its whiteness, and waited for the Russian patrol. It passed quite noisily soon after our arrival, and I prepared to get up, but Joseph held me back. The first patrol was followed by a second patrol about 100 meters away and in absolute silence. Now we were able to stand up and continue on our way. After walking a few hundred meters, we stopped. I thought they walked with dogs, I whispered. We poisoned all the dogs they had. And they don't have the time or ability to raise and train dogs quickly. We moved forward with skis in our hands, for they were of no use in the dense forest. I walked on the road, clinging to branches and bumping into tree trunks. At times we had to grab each other to keep from getting lost in the darkness. We walked like that for hours. It was still snowing thickly. When dawn broke, I heard dogs barking and saw a small village. We stopped at the edge of the forest and watched the situation for an hour, and then we approached one of the houses. Joseph instantly calmed the dog, who barked at the sight of us. The door opened with a creak. A hand came out and gestured for us to enter. Our skis were taken from us and hidden somewhere. They gave us hot tea and bread and butter. Then they took me to the attic and showed me a place to rest. I'll come back later, said Joseph. When he came and burrowed into the hay beside me, going to sleep, I couldn't stand it and asked, "Why is he doing that?" Referring to the owner of the house. He's a Belarusian. He fights the Bolsheviks. Hates them. He's paid like me. I thought. No, Joseph interrupted me. I'm paid. I'm a professional. It's my job. I thought about it in silence. Do you find it strange? Joseph asked. Yes, I thought you were doing it. For pleasure? For gratitude? For medals? You could clearly hear the mockery in his voice. So you only do it for the money? It pays well. I have a family, or what's left of one. What happened to your family? Murdered. Bolshevik cavalry. I'm sorry. Joseph yawned and burrowed deeper into the hay. When do we leave? I asked. We'll wait it out for now. The master says they'll come here themselves. A part of the Bolshevik army, taking part in the manoeuvres, came to the village. At noon I was awakened by the noise raised by the Russians. There were orders, laughter and swearing. I heard several men entering the house and preparing food, talking to the owner. From a distance I could hear the clatter of horses, the rumble of carts, and the clanking of metal. I felt uneasy, but the presence of the unruffled Joseph beside me gave me confidence. There was a tense moment when I couldn't help myself, no matter how hard I tried, and I sneezed. But the sound was drowned out by the noise of voices, and no one went to investigate the attic. A few hours later we heard the signal, and Joseph went downstairs. When he returned, he reported that, as expected, the Soviet soldiers would be boarding a train on the reserve track a few kilometers away, most likely tomorrow. All the heavy equipment is in the village, but the radio station is probably not here. It's usually located at the headquarters, which is unlikely to move from its location just yet. How are we going to get in there? We'll probably be spotted, I said excitedly. At nightfall, we'll go back to the forest. We'll go round and in the morning we'll come out to the reserve way, but from the other side. There we'll wait for an opportunity. It may or may not come. When it got dark, we left the house and went deep into the forest. We went through the forest with skis on our shoulders, buried up to our waists in snow, that when the trees parted we put on our skis. Once we took a break. We sat down on a fallen tree and had a snack of bread and sausage. From a big sip from a flask, which completed the meal, a salutary warmth spread through my veins. Orienting ourselves by compass, we still could not pinpoint our exact location, so we had to crawl carefully along the railway track to find the right place. The morning was just dawning when we, absolutely exhausted, came to the edge of the forest 200 meters from the station buildings and saw several freight platforms and covered goods wagons on the spare tracks. We hid under some young spruce trees, which stood so close together that the snow lying on them formed a sort of canopy and the ground beneath them remained dry. The hare, indignant at our intrusion, jumped out of its favourite hiding place and galloped off in search of a new resting place. The silence was broken only by the hissing of the locomotive, the whispering of the wind through the treetops, and the rustling of snowflakes falling from the branches. We could see the rails going off to the left and the forest clearing just opposite us, wide enough for a lorry to pass through. To the right of the station buildings were horse-drawn wagons, sledges, 4 field guns, and a mobile kitchen with smoke billowing above it. As the light grew brighter, I could see the telescopic mast of the mobile radio station looming against the sky and the umbrella-like antennas diverging from it. We could not see the guards, but we assumed they were somewhere near the station. Soldiers must have been keeping a constant watch on the site. We could stealthily cross the tracks and get close to the radio tent, but the problem was that the station was working. It was unclear how to get what we had come all this way for. We couldn't come back empty-handed. The day dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. We froze. While one of us was keeping watch, the other was stretching his legs and rubbing his face and ears. We ate most of our rations and finished our rum. At noon, the station began to stir. The guns were dragged by hand along wooden gangways to the open goods platforms, followed by wagons. It wasn't until dusk that the mast was lowered and soldiers began to wind down the antennas. The tent that housed the radio station was rolled up and the station was dragged into a covered goods wagon. We tensely watched what was happening. "If they stay the night," Joseph whispered, "we have a chance." It was getting dark fast. The locomotive came up and the wagon couplers started to work. "It looks like they are going to leave tonight. We need to move very quickly." "Have you got a lantern?" Joseph asked. "Yes. Shall we risk it?" "Why, yes. See where the tracks turn right over there?" He pointed with his hand to make sure. "Yeah? See how the train is getting longer and longer and they're getting further away from the station. The driver's watching the coupling from the window and he doesn't have time to look round. Can you quickly jump into the carriage and get what you need and jump out?" Joseph said quickly. At first glance it seemed simple enough. It was already dark, and only the lanterns of the switchman and the bright light of the locomotive furnace broke the darkness. We left our rucksacks in the shelter under the fir trees and crawled to the place where the rails curved to the right. When we got there, we sat down to rest. My heart was beating fast and blood was pounding in my temples. With shaking hands, I shoved the hunting knife into my pocket, where I already had a torch, a notebook and a pencil. I was shivering, but not from the cold. The right carriage drew nearer. "Come on," I heard Joseph whisper, and he pushed me forward. "And remember, no footprints. I'm waiting for you here." I jumped into the open carriage door, closed it, and switched on the torch. The train stopped and then moved back towards the station. I found the four-wing nuts on the transmitter cover, unscrewed them, removed the panel, started sketching by illuminating myself, and then discovered that on the inside of the panel I had just removed was a schematic and instructions. I began hastily to copy. More quickly. Faster. Then the train stopped at the station buildings and I heard Russian speech. Hours seemed to pass before the train was in motion again. I continued my work. In a few minutes everything was ready. I put the panel in place, screwed on the nuts, and hid the notebook in my pocket. I waited for the carriage to pull up to the right place so I could jump out. Then the train stopped, the door slid open, some tools flew in, and a uniformed man jumped in. The train moved off. He didn't notice me right away. As he sat on the floor with his legs hanging out, he was unaware of my existence, but when he switched on his torch to pick up the dropped tools, the beam caught my legs. The beam crept higher and got to my face. "Who are you?" the Russian asked in surprise. In response, I pointed my torch at him and saw a hand grabbing for his holster. I kicked him with my foot in a heavy ski boot, and he fell backwards. The train began to enter the curve. The Russian suddenly sat up. Grabbing a heavy spanner, I hit him over the head with his own tool. He swayed and fell out. I jumped out of the carriage. The train was moving towards the station again. At that moment I was out of my head. Joseph was there. "Is he dead?" I heard a question. "I don't know. I think he's dead. I'd better make sure." "Wait here," Joseph said, and bent down and ran towards the man lying there. The train was returning. Joseph pulled the motionless body up, laid it on the tracks, and came back to me. The train ran over the body and back to the station again, and we disappeared into the woods. "They'll think he's had an accident," Joseph remarked as we pulled out our hidden rucksacks. "Now let's move back." All night we walked through the snow, and by dawn we reached the border. Only in the afternoon we managed to cross the border, as we lost our way and for a long time could not find the place previously agreed upon with our border guards. I was badly exhausted, but I was not allowed to rest until I had shown the notes to the captain and answered all his questions. Having received a 2-week holiday, I spent it in Gazilovka. I went skiing, hunting, went round and round all the neighbours. In general, I had a holiday at my own pleasure. When the time came to return to Stanislav, it was clear to everyone that I was not very excited about it. "You're not too fond of the army, son?" asked my mother. "The army is discipline, and I hate it. You can't even sneeze without asking permission. I'd rather be a civilian. No profession, no education. University is expensive. My commanding officer said something about his idea of military education. When I get back, I'll check it out with him." It was an interesting idea. The radio intelligence service needed technically competent officers and was willing to train people who already had some experience in this field, bringing them up to university standard. If it suited me, I would be released from further service and sent to work at the communications center in Warsaw, where I would work for the intelligence service while taking a university course in radio communications. I agreed and signed the necessary papers. By then Antec had moved to Warsaw, and for 2 years While I was gaining knowledge and working at the communications center in parallel, we lived together. I got my degree and was offered a full-time position with promotion every 5 years, and in case of exceptional ability and outstanding merit, every 3 years. The prospect of working in the same building year after year, in the same room, with the same people, going to work on the same route, arriving at the same time was not for me. I couldn't accept it and turned down the assignment. I wanted to see the world. The easiest way, it seemed to me, was to go sailing. I became a radio operator and spent some really happy years sailing on different ships on many seas, visiting many countries, anchored in various ports. These were carefree years when I gained experience and new impressions, years of wanderings that left only pleasant memories. At the beginning of July 1939, returning from the Mediterranean, we stopped in Antwerp, where a consular official handed me an official letter. It read, "To Second Lieutenant in the Reserve Stefan Gazelle. On arrival in Gdynia, you should leave the ship and return to Warsaw, where you should report to your liaison regiment for further instructions." An official who knew the contents of the letter said, "It looks like preparations for mobilization. You're not the only one who's being summoned. All the specialists are being rounded up. Do you think war is coming?" I don't have any ideas about it, I confessed. From Antwerp we were ordered to return to Dunkirk, where we loaded French tanks, and from there we went to Gdynia. But we did not go through the Kiel Canal as before, but through Skagerrak. I received orders to report any movements of German warships. Tension grew and was even more intense when we arrived in Gdynia. While we were standing under unloading, the dock was cordoned off by the military. I said goodbye to my comrades on the ship and to my friends in Gdynia and left by night train for Warsaw, where I arrived the next morning. The first thing I did was to visit Antek. During the time we had not seen each other, he had married, and his wife Jadzia was expecting a child. Antek was seriously worried. "I don't know where to send my wife if war breaks out. Warsaw will be bombed." "Do you think war will break out?" "I don't know, but the atmosphere is tense. There's a call up for reservists. You're only one of many, and the Germans are intensifying their propaganda against us. When do you have to report to your regiment?" "I'll be with you for a while. Come and say goodbye to me if you're sent back from Warsaw." "I will. Though I think I've been called back for retraining." How wrong I was. I realized it as soon as I arrived at the regiment on the outskirts of Warsaw. There was a terrible commotion. Reservists, officers and privates were urgently solving all the pressing issues related to uniforms, equipment, food and assignments. When I appeared before the battalion commander, he looked me over with suspicion. "You are too young to command, Gazelle, but you seem to have received special training. All right, then. I'll give you 2 staff sergeants, old-school men who can maintain discipline." "Thank you, Mr. Major." "Oh." "You'll take command of a communications company, motorized with brand-new equipment. You'll have 25 lorries and vans at your disposal. Teach your men how to operate the equipment. Start today." "Yes, Mr. Major," and keep their mouths shut. "Yes, Mr. Major." And no dismissals. "That goes for you too." "Yes, Mr. Major." I was very busy for the first 3 weeks of August getting acquainted with my subordinates, studying the equipment, conducting classes. I hardly had time to read newspapers or listen to the radio. On 22nd August, Jadzia was having an evening out, and I managed to get a leave of absence to go and visit. My presence in uniform turned the conversation back to the usual course. Everyone was concerned about one question: would there be a war? Opinions were divided. Most thought there would be no war. Tadeusz, Antek's mate, argued that the Germans would not take the risk. If they made war, the British would wring their necks the next day, you know. Tadeusz declared that a Polish-British agreement has been concluded. Britain has a powerful navy and air fleet. No one brought up Soviet Russia, and no one, of course, knew that on this day, 22nd August 1939, Hitler had addressed the commanders of the Wehrmacht. The documents of the Nuremberg trials attest to this. On 1st September, the attack on Poland will begin, Hitler declared. The destruction of Poland is our first task. Even if war breaks out in the West, our first task will be the destruction of Poland. No mercy. Be cruel. Be ruthless. We must reach the Vistula and Neri rivers. Given our military superiority, we will defeat the Poles. We must crush all centres of Polish resistance. Our goal is the total destruction of Poland. Naturally, we knew nothing about this, and the evening at Jadzi's was a great success. But the very next day my regiment was put on alert. We were issued live ammunition, and unit commanders were told to which army groups their units were attached. My company was assigned to the 6th Army Group in southeastern Poland. During the night we started loading into wagons. I phoned Antek and he rushed over to see me off. We had very little time, and what could we say to each other? We realized now that war was inevitable. Take care of yourself, Stefan, and write to your mother, Antek admonished me. She remembers the last war too well, and will worry about you. Poor Mum. What have you decided about Jadzi? It's too late to do anything now. We're staying in Warsaw. The orderly came round. If Mum were here, said Antek, she would find patriotic words appropriate to the occasion. I don't have any. Take care of yourself, Stefan. Don't be a hero. Come back alive. I'll try, Antek. I'll see you when it's over. This can't last much longer, can it? Time's up. I looked after Antek. He turned round a few times as he left. His little brother was going off to war.